everybody again. Welcome everybody to the last session of this international workshop of anti-nuclear movements and initiatives in Brazil since the end of the Cold War. I think we have the privilege to have a great panel now on Brazil and the efforts to create the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And we have exponents both from the civil society and the institutions. So it will be great to see how this kind of effort was actually the fruit of a common strategy or a common, let's say, policy from both NGOs but also state actors. So for discussing about this, we have three panelists: Sérgio de Queiroz Duarte, Cláudio Leopoldino, and Christian Wittmann. I just give a brief introduction of our three panelists. Sérgio Duarte is currently president of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. That's an international organization that seeks a world free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, whose aims is to develop and support the use of scientific, evidence-based policymaking, focusing on areas where nuclear and weapons of mass destruction risks are present by bringing together scholars and public figures to work toward reducing the danger of armed conflict and to seek solutions to global security threats. Before that, Sérgio was for many years a Brazilian diplomat and is now a retired ambassador with a very long experience in the nuclear and disarmament affairs. Let's remember that Sérgio was a young diplomat composing the Brazilian delegation in the UN negotiation back in 67, 68. And is also, for all his efforts in the disarmament field, he was also the president of one of the past NPT review conferences. He has been also the president of the board of governors of the IAEA, and the UN. He was UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Then we have Cláudio Medeiros Leopoldino, who is a Brazilian diplomat, and he's the head of the Disarmament and Sensitive Technology Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Brazil. I want to remember that this division is responsible for dealing with nuclear issues historically, and also one of the main, let's say, initiators of any Brazilian proposal in the field of disarmament and nuclear issues. So he's a key member of the Brazil's foreign policy decision-making process in this field. So it will be an honor also, is an honor having Cláudio Leopoldino here. And the last but not least, a colleague from the Federal University of Unipampa, Christian Wittmann, who holds a PhD in law and is an assistant professor at Unipampa, where he teaches in the area of law and public administration at both undergraduate and graduate level. And Christian is here with in the quality not just as a scholar but also, I think, as an activist, since he has been active, of course, in the field of international law as a delegate of the international campaign to ban landmines. Was one of the organization, was a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997, then of the Cluster Munition Coalition, also of the Seguridad Humana in Latin America and Caribe, Human Security in Latin America and Caribbean, and the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was awarded in 2017 of the with the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm very proud to say that it is also one of the partners of this research project. So I think that we are concluding our activities with one of the key issues that I think also they are their roots in the last period of the Cold War when there was the activism war was popping up. But now I would like to give the word to Ambassador Sérgio Duarte. Sérgio, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Carlo. And good morning, everyone. And also greet my two colleagues, Councillor Cláudio Leopoldino from Itamaraty, and Professor Wittmann, my colleague also in many of the activities in disarmament and this kind of affairs that we deal with. It's a pity, I regret not be able to have come to Guyana. It would be my second time if I did, but I hope I have a future opportunity to see you in your beautiful city, Carlo. And again, thank you very much for inviting me. I understand that Cláudio and Christian will deal with the details of the history of the negotiation of the TPNW. And I intend to do something a little different, to use my 15 minutes or so to describe the evolution of the views and positions of Brazil that led Brazil to support, to become a supporter, and I hope of a party very soon of the TPNW. My opinions, however, are also mine, only mine, and I do not speak for the Brazilian government, and my views should not be confused with the government of Brazil. I think that the basic assumption behind Brazilian actions in matters of nuclear non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament is that weapons of mass destruction, and particularly nuclear weapons, are unacceptable because of the inhumane and indiscriminate effects on people and on the environment. Moreover, instead of promoting peace, these weapons generate insecurity and threaten to extinguish human life on the planet as we know it. Therefore, Brazil is convinced that nuclear disarmament is an indispensable means to enhance peace and security for all nations and to ensure the survival of human civilization. Brazil has a long and very active history of participation in multilateral efforts towards nuclear disarmament. And in the debates and negotiations within the major international institutions and instruments in this field. A recurrent Brazilian endeavor has been to prevent the curtailment of scientific knowledge and to permit unhindered use of science and technology for economic and social development, in accordance with international commitments and with the principles and purposes of the Charter of the UN. The promise of economic progress based on the inexhaustible power of the atom was known to humanity long before nuclear energy was introduced to the world with fire and fury in August 1945. Perhaps few in this audience will be old enough to have a personal recollection of the impact of the use of atomic explosives against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United Nations had been created barely 3 weeks before, and the first experimental atomic detonation before the first experimental atomic declaration. And for this reason, the Charter of the UN does not contain any mention to nuclear weapons. 5 months after the adoption of the Charter, the first resolution adopted by the General Assembly reflected the awe and concern of nations with the effects of that new and terrifying power. In typical UN language, Resolution number 1, adopted in 1946, called for the establishment of a commission, and I quote, to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy. It was the way that the UN found how to reflect the problems that have been raised. As a member of the Security Council, Brazil was a natural member of that commission. Admiral Álvaro Alberto, a distinguished physicist, a Navy officer, had also been involved in projects to develop a domestic nuclear industry in Brazil, and he was the Brazilian representative in the Commission. He had been responsible for the negotiations regarding export of radioactive sands containing thorium, and was known for his insistence that payment to provision of that source of fissionable material should be made in the form of technological assistance, not money. As we recall, the mandate of the Commission was to make proposals, and again I quote from the resolution, proposals for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction. It is important to note that the aim of eliminating such weapons was then accepted unanimously. But it took 71 years for that objective to take legal form in the TPNW. No other multilateral agreements besides the TPNW adopted in these 7 decades aimed specifically at abolishing nuclear weapons. Because of the deep rivalry of mistrust between the two superpowers at the time, the Commission failed to achieve any consensus and was disbanded 3 years later. The focus of international attention shifted to setting rules on the development and possession of nuclear weapons and forgot elimination as a main goal. As I mentioned before, Brazil envisaged the development of a viable national nuclear industry, and also the reduction of its dependence on foreign sources of technology. It was a time of the Cold War, a deep ideological struggle that divided the world in 2 blocks of adversarial states. For countries in the periphery of that conflict, like Brazil, it seemed advisable to keep options open and not to accept restrictions to scientific progress regarding the uses of nuclear energy, and at the same time promoting disarmament. Brazil tried to pursue these objectives both internationally and domestically. In 1967, a national plan for the full development of nuclear energy, including a complete nuclear fuel cycle, was adopted. A nuclear power plant had been purchased from the American company Westinghouse and installed on the coast of the state of Rio de Janeiro. However, the contract did not provide for the transfer of reactor technology. In the mid-1970s, an ambitious agreement was signed with the Federal Republic of Germany for the construction of 8 nuclear plants to generate electric power, including provision of uranium enrichment technology intended to produce fuel for the reactors. Opposition from the United States, particularly during the Carter administration, as well as persistent internal financial problems, caused delays in the construction of the first 2 power plants under the agreement with Germany. A reevaluation of the program, together with budgetary constraints, postponed some projects, and eventually a decision was made to establish an autonomous program aiming at the mastery of the fuel cycle. In 1987, the success of this program was publicly announced when Brazil announced that it had mastered the fuel cycle, complete fuel cycle. Brazil was also active in the multilateral arena. The United Nations decided in 1962 to enlarge the existing 10-nation disarmament committee, composed of representatives of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and add to those 10 nations 8 members not belonging to either of the 2 rival military alliances. Brazil and Mexico were the Latin American countries chosen for the new commission. By about the same time, 5 states had already obtained nuclear weapons. And there was concern in the international community about the possibility that a considerable number of other nations would follow the same path. It was obviously in the interest of those that already possessed nuclear weapons, as well as those that did not, to prevent further nuclear proliferation. That concern prompted the Brazilian Minister of External Relations at the time to suggest at the UN General Assembly in 1961 the establishment of Latin American zone free of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states did not immediately support the idea, but Latin American countries joined in pushing the proposal forth. And the Treaty of Tlatelolco was adopted in February '67, almost 1.5 years before the NPT. Proliferation of nuclear weapons became a general concern. A wide majority of the United Nations supported Irish proposals for the negotiation of a non-proliferation treaty. Resolution 2028, adopted in 1965, established the principles on which a future treaty should be based. Prominent among such principles were A, that the treaty should be void of any loopholes which might permit nuclear or non-nuclear powers to proliferate, directly or indirectly, nuclear weapons in any form. And the second important principle was that the treaty should embody an acceptable balance of mutual responsibilities and obligations of the nuclear and non-nuclear powers. I think it will be very hard to say that those two principles have been fully embodied in the NPT. After 3 years of debate at the 18 Nation Disarmament Committee, there was no consensus on a draft treaty on non-proliferation. In March '68, the two co-chairs, who were the representatives of the Soviet Union and the United States, sent to the General Assembly a draft, which in their opinion reflected the views expressed in the discussions. However, there were 4 negative votes and 21 abstentions on Resolution 2373 of June 12, 1968, which recommended the opening of the NPT to the signatory states. Now, this result shows that roughly 1/4 of the UN membership at the time was not ready to accept the NPT. Brazil cast one of the abstaining votes. In its view, the draft had several shortcomings, and particularly it failed to address adequately the balance of responsibilities and obligations between nuclear and non-nuclear states, and did not provide for stronger disarmament commitments. During the following decade, Brazil spent much time and energy in multilateral disarmament forums, deflecting criticism about its decision not to join the NPT, and trying to allay suspicions about its nuclear program, while at the same time advocating concrete measures of nuclear disarmament. The slow increase in membership in the NPT afforded Brazil a relatively comfortable interval within an international context that was dominated by the rivalry between the superpowers and their respective military alliances. Following the first special session of the General Assembly on Disarmament, called the SSOD-1 in 1969, Brazil upgraded its representation at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and established a permanent office for disarmament affairs. During the following years, Brazilian delegations to the CD consistently and unsuccessfully demanded the establishment of an ad hoc group on nuclear disarmament, while devoting efforts to the ongoing negotiation of draft articles of a chemical weapons convention and the treaty that to prohibit nuclear tests. Not being a member of the NPT, Brazil felt free to pursue its domestic plans, in spite of objections from the possessors of nuclear weapons and their allies. Cooperation between Brazil and Argentina, both on the political and multilateral front, in technical aspects of the two countries' respective nuclear programs, increased during the period, and particularly after the end of military regimes in the two countries. Dr. Marzo has provided us with the main result of those understandings between Brazil and Argentina in those times. By the beginning of the 1990s, the international context had experienced major changes with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the expectation of an era of lowering of tensions and increased international cooperation based on Western democratic ideology and neoliberal economic theories. The larger majority of the international community had adhered to the NPT, increasing the pressure on Brazil to join the instrument. The creation in 1991 of the Argentine-Brazilian Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials, ABACC, and the quadripartite agreement with the IAEA in 1994 were important elements in the evolution of Brazil's posture regarding the NPT. In the mid-1990s, only 4 states besides Brazil were not party to the NPT. The PRK, India, Israel, and Pakistan. And all these countries had acquired or came to acquire nuclear weapons. Despite the discriminatory character of the instrument, the continued shunning of the NPT by Brazil was seen as the highest level of a Brazilian government to have become a liability. The supply of much needed technology and materials for the strategic development of projects was increasingly uncertain. Brazil risked isolation and lingering suspicions in the international disarmament and security debate. And these considerations were central to the decision that was finally taken to join the NPT. It was in the interest of Brazil to dispel unfounded doubts and interpretation about its intentions. A number of steps in that direction were taken. In 1991, Brazil and Argentina signed the Guadalajara Agreement, which created ABACC. And in 1996, Brazil became a full party to the Treaty of Tlatelolco and to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And after the indefinite extension of the NPT was agreed in 1995, the Brazilian government decided that it was time to re-examine its position, and accordingly, it signed the NPT in 1996 and ratified it in 1998. Brazil did not, however, abandon its principled position on the need for nuclear disarmament. Legislative Decree 65, which formalized the ratification of the NPT, states very clearly, and I'll quote from there, the adherence of Brazil to the present treaty is linked to the understanding that according to its Article 6, effective measures will be taken with a view to the cessation at an early date of the nuclear arms race with the complete elimination of all atomic weapons. And then there was the National Defense Strategy adopted in December 18, 2008, and it states there that Brazil will not subscribe to any additions to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty intended to broaden restrictions established by the treaty without the nuclear weapon powers having made progress on the central premise of that treaty, their own nuclear disarmament. Upon acceding to the NPT, Brazil became a very active player in the context of the instrument, particularly through the New Agenda Coalition, which played a leading role in the drafting and adoption of the 13 practical steps for the systematic and progressive efforts to implement Article 6 of the NPT at the 2000 NPT Review Conference. In 2005, Brazil accepted the suggestion to present itself as a candidate to the presidency of the next review conference. And the 2005 conference failed due to radical positions taken by different parties, particularly the refusal of nuclear weapon states to recognize the validity of the understandings and agreements that had been reached only 5 years before, in 2000. The following review conference in 2010 was able to adopt a final document with a number of recommendations and a plan of action. As was the case in previous instances, the plan of action did not have practical application. But the most important result of that conference was the unanimous expression of the deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and the reaffirmation of the need of all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Now, this development sparked an international movement supported by a large number of states, including Brazil, and several civil society organizations that led to the negotiation and adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In December 2016, on the initiative of Austria, Brazil, Ireland, Nigeria, Mexico, and South Africa, and the support of a wide majority of the United Nations states, Resolution 71/2058 was adopted, which decided to convene in 2017 a United Nations conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Brazil played an important part in the ensuing negotiations. Despite the fierce opposition of the nuclear weapon states and their allies, the TPNW today is part of the corpus of international law and reflects the repudiation of a large number of nations to nuclear weapons. I am sure that our debate today will enhance the importance of Brazilian ratification of the TPNW. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Duarte. I give the word now to Consular Leopoldino. Thank you, Cláudio.
Thank you very much, Carlo. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to be at the same panel as Ambassador Duarte and as Christian, two long-time collaborators in this struggle. And it's a very interesting opportunity to pick up where Ambassador Duarte left off, and also to build upon the presentation made earlier this morning by Marzo, which means that I only have to lead into the specifics of the negotiation of the TPNW without having to make a specific reference to the history that led Brazil to play its role in these negotiations, which I'm sure the audience will now understand much better than they would if I had to explain it on the basis of the presentations by Ambassador Duarte and by Marzo. So Brazil played, of course, a key role, as has been mentioned by Ambassador Duarte, in those negotiations, and that is not by chance. This is a consequence of the overall stance of the country vis-à-vis the issue of disarmament and non-proliferation since its accession to the NPT in 1998. Brazil decided to join the NPT in spite of a long history of opposition to the unequal and unbalanced nature of the treaty, which sets different rights and obligations to its member states and privileges the obligations of non-nuclear weapons states with regards to the non-proliferation, as opposed to the obligations it sets to nuclear weapon states when it comes to disarmament, which are open-ended and non-specific, and have, as of yet, not materialized, and there is no perspectives for this to happen in the near to medium term. So on the basis of this change in stance, Brazil decided to join the NPT and to influence the regime from within and to push for the materialization, to the realization of its objectives regarding the elimination of nuclear weapons, which are enshrined in its Article 6. This is not just a matter of decision, specific decision taken at the time by the Foreign Ministry, but is enshrined in the very legislative decree that authorized, through which the Brazilian Congress authorized the accession to the NPT. The decree specifically states that Brazil joins the treaty on the understanding that it will, on the basis of its Article 6, lead to the cessation of the nuclear arms race and to the elimination of all atomic weapons. Another mark of this participation, Brazil's participation in the NPT, has been the fact that it has, as soon as it became a member of the treaty, a state party to the treaty, it has become a part of the New Agenda Coalition, which was a coalition that was formed among states from different regions, from all walks of international life, so to speak, and that are bound together by one single objective, which is the realization of Article 6 obligations regarding nuclear disarmaments. And this New Agenda Coalition, which is formed by Brazil, South Africa, Ireland, New Zealand, and at the time, well, Mexico as well, I'm sorry, almost, and at the time as well, Sweden and Slovenia, which the latter two later decided to leave the coalition, became a key actor in the negotiation of the NPT and in the adoption of what to this day are the only practical commitments that were adopted by the nuclear weapon states with regard to nuclear weapons, the elimination of nuclear weapons, which are the 13 steps towards nuclear disarmament adopted in 2000, and the 2010 action plan, the 64-point action plan that was adopted at the 2010 review conference. NAC, as we usually call it, played a key role towards that end. However, in parallel to these negotiations regarding nuclear disarmament, 2010 also marked the beginning of a prise de conscience, as they say in France, a build-up of conscience regarding the need to incorporate a dimension that had long been, if not ignored, played down in the context of the NPT, which is the humanitarian aspect of nuclear weapons. The humanitarian impact of weapons of mass destruction has historically been one of the key drivers for the prohibition and elimination of these weapons. This is on the basis of the chemical weapons regime and of the biological weapons regime. These weapons were prohibited mainly because they were thought to be unconscionable and unacceptable on moral grounds. This dimension had long been played down, even though there is a reference to it in the preamble of the NPT. Discussions about the humanitarian impact on nuclear weapons have long been played down in the context of the regime. In 2010, this began to change. Many states had given a particular emphasis to this aspect, also with the help of civil society, organized civil society that had begun to articulate itself around this idea. And this is one of the reasons why the review conference of the 2010 review conference of the NPT, for the first time, included in its final document a reference to the unacceptable humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. This has been an important driver of a discussion that started immediately after the review conference. With the launch of the humanitarian impact conferences that began in 2013, and 3 of these conferences were held between 2013 and 2014, and they served as a stage for a very detailed and in-depth assessment of this very issue, the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. A lot had been said and analyzed about the strategic consequences of the existence of nuclear weapons, but very little attention had been devoted to the effects that the possible uses of those weapons would have on humanity. And these conferences were a pathfinder in this regard. A lot of investigations of research that had been not seriously considered within the NPT regime came to the fore. Very interesting research that illuminated the effects of even a very minor exchange of nuclear weapons and the impact that it would have for the whole of humanity were brought to the fore in these discussions. So this is the basis of this process that led later on to the negotiation of the TPNW. This another very interesting element that I have to mention here is the launch of the website Wildfire. It's still active for those that are interested in the history of the negotiations. It was an anonymous website that was launched in 2013 and very quickly spread like wildfire, which was the very intention of the creators of this website, which outlined the path for the negotiation of the TPNW in a very prescient manner. The basis of this proposal that was put forward anonymously was an assessment that the discussions on nuclear disarmament on the NPT would lead to nowhere, and that would be by design, because they were conceived with that objective. The fact that the DNPT doesn't set specific obligations, deadlines, and commitments to ensure that its Article 6 is, as at some point realized, was being used by the states that have, through this very same article, the right to retain their weapons to paralyze negotiations. And this website claimed that the only way through which this deadlock could be broken is if non-nuclear weapon states launched a parallel negotiation process towards making nuclear weapons illegal, pure and simple, with or without, most likely without, the participation of nuclear weapon states and those states that rely on nuclear weapons indirectly for their security. And this is a reference to states that are members of military alliances in which the use of nuclear weapons is part of their strategic doctrine, and this is a reference in particular to NATO, but not only to NATO. There are other states that rely on the assurances provided by nuclear weapons regarding their security, with or without formal assurances. So launching these negotiations was the only way to break the stalemate and to actually increase the pressure on nuclear weapon states to make their commitments a reality. This has been hugely influential, even though it has no formal standing. The Wildfire's website had no formal standing whatsoever. It was even anonymous to begin with. But if you read the proposals put forward by Wildfire, you see that it's exactly the way things happened in real life. So it was an extremely prescient proposal. And in the middle of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapon conferences, Austria put forward what it became known as the Austrian Pledge in 2014. And it's basically a pledge to ensure that the ban of nuclear weapons becomes a reality. Brazil, at the end of this process, joined it had participated in an open-ended working group that had been called by the General Assembly to discuss the possibilities towards that end, to the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But in 2016, that was when the key step was taken by a group of countries, which became known as the Core Group. It's a group of countries that were committed to the pledge of negotiating a TPNW. And this group put forward a resolution at the General Assembly calling for the establishment of a conference to negotiate a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That was a key step that led to the adoption of the TPNW in the setting that it was adopted. And that was key, that was critical, because unlike other treaties that had been launched on the margins of the Conference of Disarmament, which is the conference, the body that it's mandated to negotiate disarmament treaties, the treaty had been negotiated. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated within the framework of the United Nations. It was not a standalone treaty. It was, from the very beginning, part of the disarmament architecture of the UN. Unlike, for example, the Anti-Personnel Landmine Ban Convention or the Cluster Munition Convention, which were negotiated outside the UN and later became attached to the UN through resolutions that were adopted in the General Assembly. But from the very beginning, the CPNW was part of the UN disarmament machinery through this, the adoption of this resolution, in which Brazil was one of the co-sponsors. Brazil also took part very actively in the negotiations themselves and made a few key contributions to the process. Together, of course, it was not a purely national undertaking. All of this happened in a very participatory mechanism. But some of the key aspects of the treaty in which Brazil exerted its influence were, for example, in the recognition of the importance of peaceful uses. The treaty is not an anti-nuclear as a whole. It's not a treaty that demonizes the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, quite the contrary. It recognizes very specifically that nuclear energy can and should be used for peaceful purposes. It's enshrined in its preamble of paragraph 21, and Brazil was one of the proponents of this element. Brazil also, in the lead up to the negotiations of the TPNW, was one of the proponents of the approach of focusing on the prohibition first and leaving the details on how it would come about for a later stage. And this is one of the elements that allowed the negotiations to proceed, because for a long time the discussions on a possible comprehensive convention on nuclear weapons were bogged down in details as to what would be the specifics of the destruction, how they would happen, which organizations would be in charge of overseeing this process. It would be, according to this approach, a convention on nuclear weapons would have a similar structure as the convention on chemical weapons, which is extremely detailed. It includes definitions, deadlines, creates an international organization tasked with overseeing its implementation, and so on and so forth. It's a very long convention with like more than 100 pages. If this approach had been followed, probably we wouldn't have a TPNW to this day. So the proposal at that time was to focus on the prohibition and leave the details for implementation of the elimination of nuclear arsenals at the for a later stage, but to set a very clear legal norm first and build our efforts after that. That was one of Brazil's contributions to this process. I'm not saying that we were the only ones to have this idea, but in a working paper that was presented in the negotiations, this idea was outlined, and it was one of the reasons why the negotiations could proceed. The issue of assistance to victims is also a very important element of the treaty. It is, of course, a key aspect of a treaty that aspires to address the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and not only of possible victims of future uses of nuclear weapons, but also addresses the issue of victims of nuclear testing, which is another key element that ensured the success of the treaty, because it ensured that it would have the support of states from a variety of regions that were deeply affected by nuclear testing over time, in the Pacific, in Northern Africa, and so on and so forth. So the treaty is what it is. It establishes a very clear norm against nuclear weapons. It does so in a way that allows for states that currently possess those weapons to join at the later stage if they decide to do so. And includes humanitarian perspectives at the fore of its structure. And since the very beginning has been the object of fierce opposition by nuclear weapon states and by nuclear umbrella states, as we call the states that rely on nuclear weapons indirectly for their security. To varying degrees. Some states have been fiercer in their opposition, some have been less vocal, but the opposition has been there. And one of the criticisms that has been leveled at the TPNW is the supposed fact that it does not consider security realities and aspires to ban nuclear weapons by fiat, by a decision that is not grounded on reality. This is a common criticism, but we believe it is not true. We believe that the TPNW, of course, has a focus on humanitarian aspects of nuclear weapons, but at the same time, it is firmly grounded on the perception of security of non-nuclear weapon states that had long been ignored in the context of the NPT. Non-nuclear weapon states have made a bargain by accepting the commitment not to acquire nuclear weapons, in return to the commitment to nuclear weapon states to eliminate those weapons, in particular because of the risk that those weapons might be used as instruments of coercion against those that do not possess those weapons. And this has time and again happened since the adoption of the NPT. So our security concerns have long been ignored in the context of the NPT. And this is one of the drivers for the adoption of the TPNW. Brazil, in pushing for the adoption of the TPNW, is not acting only on the basis of humanitarian concerns, although they are extremely important, but it's also acting on the basis of its own security considerations. Brazil, through the adoption of the TPNW and through the consolidation of the legal norm against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, is seeking an enhancement of its own national security through the reduction of the risk that these weapons might at some point be used against itself, be it directly or indirectly, or that it might suffer the consequences of a nuclear exchange in a different region. So one of the interesting aspects of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapon conferences is that many studies have been presented in these conferences regarding a possible hypothetical exchange of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan, for example, which are the possessors of the two smallest arsenals in the world, together with North Korea. And even in that very specific limited scenario, the consequences to the human race as a whole would be absolutely dreadful. The nuclear winter that would be generated by the clouds of debris that would spread all around the world, and the follow-up of a possible nuclear exchange would have a direct impact on agriculture and would reduce significantly the productivity of crops worldwide, and that would aggravate already existing problems in terms of famine, in terms of human health. So this is certainly not something that we can believe naively that wouldn't affect us, even if Brazil never becomes entangled in nuclear confrontation. Any use of nuclear weapons would have terrible consequences for humanity as a whole, and that includes, of course, Brazil. So this is on the basis of our considerations. This is reflected in the submission of the treaty to the National Congress, where it still is awaiting its ratification. Brazil was the first state to sign the treaty in 2017, but at this point is the only member of the original core group that hasn't yet ratified the treaty. This, of course, we recognize that the National Congress is absolutely sovereign in considering proposals for international obligations to bind the Brazilian government. But from the point of view of the executive branch, the urgent ratification of the TPNW would be extremely beneficial to our standing as a country that has for a long time been one of the key proponents of nuclear disarmament, and of course would enable us, the Brazilian diplomacy, to act fully within the contract, the policy-making organs of the treaty, which have become fully operational since its entry into force in early 2021, to steer it towards adequate implementation, and of course to act in favor of its universalization. Brazil has participated in the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW that was held last year in July in Vienna. well, although it had to participate as an observer due to the fact that its ratification process hadn't been completed. But it did so, and it did participate in the preparatory process to the first meeting of states parties, contributing one of the key working papers that were later whose recommendations were later adopted at the final document of the meeting of states parties. Although from now on, since the treaty is already in force and fully operational, our participation will be limited for as long as the treaty is not ratified, because we can only be an observer state. We cannot take part directly in the decision-making process of the treaty. So for us at the executive branch, ratification of the treaty would be extremely beneficial, as I said, and we intend to work with the newly installed legislature to ensure that the ratification process proceeds at as a speedy rate as possible. That's what I would like to say, but I'm of course very open to any questions that might come from the audience or from the people that are following us online, and I look forward to hearing Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cláudio. It is very informative discussion and presentation on Brazil's position, and also for the need. I think I speak personally, but I think it's something that can be shared by many here in academia, for the need of ratification of this important treaty by Brazil. Christian, now the word is yours. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much, Carlo. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And well, Carlos and my friend Sérgio, I prefer to call in the first name because I feel I understand them as friends and colleagues for let's say a better future. Also, it's a pleasure to be even virtually at a public federal university as mine, and see the continued work promoting science after all these years of unprovoked aggressions and attacks on our functioning. Well, it's also a pleasure to be with Carlos, with the speakers, because they made my life easier. Cláudio just made a good speech, showing the history of the TPNW, and also Sérgio made a very let's say diligent history of the Brazilian perspective on nuclear weapons. So my intention here is more to share some of my, let's say, personal notes of the history of ICANN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and how this campaign became, let's say, the main civil society actor on the TPNW since my initial contact with this NGO back in 2010. And it's interesting for me, especially to listening in Cláudio his speech and reviving my memories. And I'm not mentioning today the Wildfire website, but it's interesting how this website at that time could influence the entire process in special national positions. I remember that was that Wildfire launched an open letter even to the Brazilian new ambassador in Geneva, trying to pursue a new, let's say, a new perspective for a Brazilian posture on the negotiations of the NPT and the efforts on the CD also. So it is. Thank you for reminding myself of those good moments in the past. Well, of course, that open letter was unprovoked by the Brazilian delegation, but it was. I'm not sure why he chose Brazil to attack at that moment in order to attack the CD and the deadlock at that forum. So also, I want to explain that even being part of the ICANN for many years, including serving as at the International Steering Group for almost the past decade, I'm not speaking on behalf of ICANN. Please do not link my personal views to the ICANN positions. ICANN and the TPNW are, of course, part of the humanitarian disarmament movement that has its landmark back to the 90s, when the campaign to ban landmines had its great momentum that created the anti-personal mine ban treaty that Cláudio also mentioned, also known as the Ottawa Treaty. The International Campaign to Ban Landmines, ICBL, promoted a game change regarding weapons governance as the inclusion of the civil society in the diplomatic discussions, the humanitarian impact of weapons as a preferred perspective, and the protection of civilians instead of the state security. This became the landmark of the humanitarian disarmament movement since 1997, which inspired different campaigns. In the past decades, it was possible to note, besides the Ottawa Treaty, the emerging norms banning cluster bombs, that unfortunately Brazil is not part of it yet, the Arms Trade Treaty, that pursues an international regulation for arms transfers, the TPNW, and also the most recent talks and international talks. As a result, a weak document when it concludes with one. ICANN, which started in 2007, it's now recognized as the key civil society actor when it comes to the negotiation. Can you hear me now, Carlo?
Christian, yes, but I think we lost you for 1 minute, something like that. So we're not be able to hear you. I think the people at YouTube was able to hear you, but not us in the Google Meet room.
Okay. I was probably speaking regarding the international multilateral regimes as the Oslo Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munition, and also the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty. That besides at the same time with those multilateral talks on those specific issues, also we had specific international coalitions dealing and leading the discussions on each topic. I mentioned the Cluster Munition Coalition, the Control Arms Campaign, ICANN, the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INEW, and the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, that nowadays is leading the talks on the potentially prohibition on autonomous weapons systems. And what I was mentioning is that all these campaigns and movements have in common the pillars of the humanitarian disarmament movement. They were not negotiated in the same forum as Cláudio mentioned it in his speech. The Mine Ban Treaty was negotiated in a standalone process. Also, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but the ATT was negotiated under the UNGA General Assembly rules. So the TPNW. So ICANN, as the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, it started in 2007, and now it's recognized as the key civil society actor and the civil society coordinator, including during the meeting of states parties. The anti-nuclear movement in general gathers an expressive number of organizations with different singular and legitimate perspectives, of course. we can find easily organizations that call for an elimination, for a comprehensive convention, those that seek for a step-by-step process. So it's just to give a few examples of how the movement is diverse. I can start to receive then attention in this international arena due to its capacity to centralize not only a different narrative regarding the elimination of nuclear weapons, also got together various members of civil society campaigns in the same network to move together with one discourse. As you can imagine, this does not happen from one day to another. In the early days, the movement had the participation not only disarmament and human rights campaigners, but also those linked with the environmental protection. Around 2010, there were many members of the ICBL, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, and the Cluster Munition Coalition campaigns that now are only one NGO that became closer to the movement created by ICANN, with the growing perspective of a need for a ban on those weapons as the first step to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons in the future. The experience of this group of campaigners was fundamental to ICANN and its growing arguments. As these campaigners were used to work together before in other issues, it was quick to use all these, let's say, social community links in order to promote ICANN values and objectives globally. Regionally, it was possible to observe the campaign growing in Latin America. Campaigns, even with a small number and financial support, were very assertive. I can nominate the CELAC network, the IPPNW in Costa Rica, the national Pugwash coalitions. We had outreach programs at Unipampa, which I was coordinating at that time. People at UNILA in Foz do Iguaçu. Campaigners also in Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Mexico were important to the ICANN work at that time. And of course, nowadays. Since perfect. So in 2000, we had a seminar in Punta del Este, Uruguay, with participants from 12 countries. It wasn't the first time I met Sérgio Duarte. That at the time, if I remember, he was the ambassador, the Brazilian ambassador in 2015. There was a second one in San Jose, Costa Rica, with the same format. The same systematic happening in different continents. New York, other disarmament conferences. ICANN members got together, actors in those contexts, for an exchange of views and of light breakfast in different national missions in New York, including the Brazilian, under the of ICANN work to engage key people for the ban perspective. Even weapons receive good attention, it's a very, let's say, I will try to be those conversations with the NPT, the 2010 NPT action plan that recognized the deep concern.
Christian, it should be fine now. As you know very well from any federal university, sometimes we have problems with the equipment and with the network. But now I think we should be fine, we should be okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Now it seems that I lost Carlo.
Okay. No, we can hear you, but we can't see you. So try to speak. I think
that's not a problem.
Okay.
My mom can assure that I'm.
No, it's fine. Now should be fine. I'm checking with the technical responsible.
With your eyes. Based on the humanitarian dimension of the catastrophic impact of nuclear detonation, intentional or not. This argument helped to pave the way to the total ban to prevent human suffering without entering in the discussion of good hands for bad weapons, the central perspective of...
we try to resolve the technical problem here. I think we need how many minutes? Just 1 minute, and then we can go back.
Like it.
Thank you very much, Christian. We are few now here, but I would like to thank you. This was a precious witness. Let's say. Very precious in the scope of this workshop to hear you and to hear above all the action of ICANN here in South America, in Latin America in general, and in Brazil specifically. I have a direct question to you, but I think in this case also to Ambassador Duarte and to Councillor Leopoldino, or as part of the civil society, but also of the Brazilian population that is not so informed about this issue, but it's actually it should be one of the top priorities, I think, of the foreign policy. One of the issues, I think, that several times I heard is what we can do for pushing, for making pressure towards the Congress for a steady approval of this, the steady ratification of the treaty. And above all, what are the main obstacles? What do you think, what all you think, Christian, Sergio, and Cláudio, Cláudio, of course, if you can tell us that, but what are the main obstacles for the ratification? Are the parliament, the deputies and the senators not informed on the issue? They are not interested, or there are just groups of interest or lobbies that are not interested to the approval of this treaty? Thank you. This is the first question, but I know that if there are other questions, they are more than welcome.
The ratification of the treaty, but I think education to show to the members of the Committee on Foreign Relations that will examine the treaty, to visit them, why it was negotiated, why Brazil was so important in its inception, should continue to be one of the stalwarts in this. I think I am sure that from the Foreign Ministry and other places, and I certainly also from work is going on, work is being done. I'm not familiar with it, I don't follow it, but I'm sure that it's going to show the members of Congress the importance of the treaty, the importance of its ratification.
Thank you, Sergio. I pass the microphone to Councillor Leopoldino for his comments, and then I pass the word to Christian.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Well, one of the main problems we face is the fact that the ratification of treaties is usually a very lengthy process in Brazilian Congress, due to the fact that that's how the process goes. It has to be considered by a number of committees in both houses, and historically that has led to a long wait time. We hoped that this change of legislature might lead up to an opportunity to speed things up. We will certainly work with the new members of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the House of Representatives, of Chamber of Deputies, however you want to translate that, to do exactly what Ambassador Duarte said. Many of them are new in the committee. We will probably have a new rapporteur, and we will engage with the rapporteur and the committee to bring these concerns to the knowledge of the House. And certainly one of the key arguments that will be presented is the fact that the treaty represents no new obligations to Brazil. Brazil is already bound by 4 levels of international obligations regarding the prohibition of nuclear weapons, bilaterally, through the agreement with the quadripartite agreement, or bilateral, I mean, in the bilateral agreement with Argentina, also through the quadripartite agreement between Brazil, Argentina, ABACC, and the IAEA, sort of the Tlatelolco Treaty, and of course through the NPT. So the treaty does not impinge upon any obligations, and does not create any new commitments to the treaty, but it does empower Brazil with this moral standard through which to push forward the agenda of nuclear disarmament. And this compatibility with existing obligations is something that I would like to have mentioned before, but it's something that I like to stress here. The TPNW is not in opposition to the NPT. From the very beginning, it was negotiated as complementary to the NPT and as a contribution to the implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. There's absolutely nothing in the TPNW that is incompatible with the NPT in any way. This is sometimes an argument that is made by some of its opponents, which, in our view, does not simply correspond to reality. And it's certainly not an obstacle to the so-called step-by-step approach. The TPNW will not stand in the way of gradual steps towards the elimination of nuclear weapons in any way whatsoever. There's something that Brazil has been saying in many, many instances, is that for those who are opposed to the TPNW, it's of course a right of any state to decide which agreements to become a party to. But those that are not members of the TPNW are very welcome to show that the step-by-step approach might be a more effective way towards achieving the elimination of nuclear weapons. The TPNW is, for sure, a reinforcement of the nuclear taboo. Since its adoption and its entry into force internationally, it has already begun to cement and to reinforce and to consolidate a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. And this message has become even clearer at the last meeting of states parties, in which the states parties of the TPNW were the loudest voice against the resurgence of nuclear threats and to the tendency of increase in the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines worldwide. So this is a point that we need to emphasize, not only in our dealings with international partners, but also with Congress, and this is what we intend to do. Thank you.
Christian, I heard the difficulty you had in listening to Cláudio, and but he was explaining a little bit about all the difficulties, and also about, of course, the lack of obstacles that should be in Brazil, actually, towards the ratification, because there is no other binding commitment, new binding commitment for Brazil. I would like to pass you again the word, and then to Raul Montenegro, and then to Marco Marzo. Christian, the word is yours.
I just want to say that, of course, we don't see any contradiction between the NPT and the TPNW. The arguments are the same from the civil society. We see also the TPNW as a way to all states parts of the NPT to comply with the Article 6 obligation, not only the nuclear weapons states, let's say, in these words. Also, ICANN will be very active in the following weeks. We are planning a visit to Brasilia and try to pursue what actually Sérgio mentioned, the education process, and try to pursue to get the attention from the parliamentarians in order to move forward this ratification after these years of, let's say, insane deadlock.
Thank you very much, Christian. I pass the word to Raul for his comments. Raul Montenegro is one of the members of the Movimiento Antinuclear de la República Argentina. Is an historical activist, I think, against nuclear energy. Thank you, Raul. Microphone is not working. Your microphone, Raul, if you can put it down.
This is closed. Now it's over. How are you? I also, of course, from the National University of Cordoba, which is one of the oldest universities in our region. And I think that I have been listening all the excellent visions. I think that we need to take into account that there is 4 scenarios now. One is the real clusters of countries having nuclear weapons. This is one of the clusters. The second scenario is the cluster of countries pushing the ban of nuclear weapons and their dismantlement. And this is clear. There is a number 3. This is a fear scenario. Is those countries working to have nuclear weapons? And of course, both move separately. Iran, for instance, is a country that is probably trying to have nuclear weapons. Thus, we have a scenario number 4. And for us, this scenario number 4 is quite important, particularly these 3 previous scenarios are moving independently. Absolutely independently, because those countries having nuclear weapons will never permit some kind of pressure for abandoning their nuclear weapons. And this scenario number 4 is the clusters of countries that don't have nuclear weapons, that don't are working to have nuclear weapons, and most of them, of course, are pushing the scenario of different kinds of bans. And this number 4 is the cluster of countries that need to be prepared for the possibility of nuclear exchanges. That means having countries prepared, not exactly for the nuclear winter, because you know that the nuclear winter has been discussed in the most recent models. But it's important to have this 4 scenario, because why? Because the previous clusters work independently. And in face of the situation between Russia and Ukraine, And I think that even the situation now in Southeastern Asia, we need not only to work in the free previous scenario, but also to be prepared for the eventuality of a nuclear exchange. And this needs also some different policies. I think that this was my comment, because sometimes we think that there is a more simplified clusters of participants, and I think that we need also to have the responsibility of preparing the civil society for the eventual exchange of nuclear weapons, not only strategic weapons, but also tactical weapons. Plus possibility of dirty bombs. This is also a matter of time. This is only my comments to be more realistic in terms of the social functioning of the world.
Thank you very much, Raul. I give now the microphone to Dr. Marco Marzo, and then I give back the word to Sérgio Duarte.
Thank you. I have a question to Cláudio. Argentina did not yet sign the ban treaty. Is there any perspective that they will join the ban treaty, or what are the reasons for that? If you could elaborate a little bit.
Thank you, Marzo, for that question. Well, I certainly cannot speak for Argentina, and I will not even attempt to do so. What I can say is that Argentina participated in the negotiations of the treaty and has chosen not to sign it to this point. But I understand that it's always a sovereign decision. Argentina has traditionally been a supporter of nuclear disarmament within the NPT and continues to do so. In the context of OPANAL, a number of declarations have been adopted about the TPNW as part of the periodical statements issued by OPANAL member states, and there's always references to the TPNW. And Argentina, even though it hasn't signed or ratified the treaty, has been very flexible regarding the adoption of these of this language. So I think that we are basically respectful of their decision not to support the treaty as of this point. But as I said before, its role as a proponent of nuclear disarmament is very much recognized. Argentina has presided over the last review conference of the NPT, which sadly was not able to reach consensus due to the very difficult political situation that we're finding right now, despite the strenuous efforts of the chair, and its role in pushing forward this agenda is very much recognized. But there is no impact whatsoever in our discussions. I think that it's mainly a national decision that might or might not be taken at the near to medium-term future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this clarification on the Argentine position. Sergio, I think this will be the last intervention of the panel.
No, just try to bring a contribution. Of course, there are groups in Argentina that are working for the ratification, for the signature of Argentina to the TPNW. Quite recently, the Latin American Pugwash movement, Pugwash group, organized a seminar. It was the Argentines, members of the Pugwash group, who organized that. So there are people working for that, and I hope that they will succeed. About the alleged incompatibility between the NPT and the TPNW, I'll point out that the TPNW is a direct result of Article 6 of the NPT, which says that parties to the treaty undertake, and it's an undertaking, it's an obligation, undertake to pursue negotiations that lead to the cessation of nuclear arms race and to nuclear disarmament. So it is in the obedience to the NPT that the TPNW exists. I think this is an important argument. And again, the TPNW especially recognizes the NPT as the main instrument for non-proliferation and disarmament. And the NPT does not say how to achieve nuclear disarmament. So the TPNW, in fact, what it does is to provide to fill one gap, one of the shortcomings of the NPT. So I think that the argument of incompatibility is a void argument. And again, I think the people who will decide on the Brazilian ratification should be informed, should understand very well that argument of the incompatibility is not a valid argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I think we are out of time. The panel should finish, I think, at noon, but I mean, we had several delays. And I would like to thank especially Professor Christian for his passions for our technical problems here at the Federal University of Goiás. But I would like to thank everybody for these 2 very productive days. I would like to thank Professor Luc-André Brunet and Dr. Irini Karamuzzi from the University of Sheffield for involving me in this wonderful project. And I would like to thank Dr. Marzo, who came here for discussing with us about ABACC, Councillor Leopoldino, but all the participants, Christian, Raul, who was with us yesterday, but also today. And I hope this kind of workshop can help also to have an impact. It's not just a workshop for understanding the historical roots of anti-nuclear activism, but also anti-nuclear initiatives like the TPNW, anti-nuclear weapons initiatives. But I hope really that we can have also an impact outside. And in this case, I think we should do an extra effort also for explaining the politician, but also the Brazilian population about the importance of this kind of efforts, of this kind of diplomatic initiatives, not only because of Brazil's role in the world, but also because we need, I think, to give some explanation to the society in a crucial issue like the nuclear realm. So thank you very much, and thank you again for participating in this initiative at the University of Goiás. Bye-bye. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Cláudio. Thank you, Christian.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Bye-bye.